Russia actively prepares for the general war with NATO in Europe.
And the money that Russia gets from the higher oil prices, it will go directly in the state budget, I imagine.
The Russians are really faking the peace process here. They're not genuinely interested in any compromise solution. What they're interested in is victory.
Welcome, everybody, to Talk Eastern Europe, where every week we sit down with a special guest to dive deeper into a topic that helps us better understand this region and what's happening here. My name is Adam Reichardt. I'm one of the co-hosts of the podcast. This week, we're going to take a look at how the war in Iran is impacting our region. While the conflict is unfolding thousands of kilometers away, its consequences are already being felt in Europe, especially in Russia's war against Ukraine, but also regarding rising energy prices. And of course, the attention now is being shifted much more towards that region. So the question I think we're going to look at in this episode is whether these developments will have an impact, what kind of impact they will have also, and what it means for Russia's position and its broader strategy towards Europe and the West. With that, we are joined by Marek Menkiszak, who is the head of the Russian department at the Center for Eastern Studies in Warsaw, OSW. Marek, thank you so much for joining us here.
Right, thank you. You're welcome.
So let's jump right in. I want to get your opinion on the ongoing war in Iran and really its impact on our region and Russia and the war in Ukraine. So let's look at first maybe how the war there is shifting global attention, but also military resources towards the Middle East. Do you think that this distraction benefits Russia and its operations in Ukraine, either by both easing pressure on Moscow or diverting even Western military support away from Kiev?
Well, as it in most cases, there are ups and downs, advantages and disadvantages for Moscow. Immediately, that was clear that there has been a lot of disadvantages. The biggest one was, again, that was not the first time, Russia proved to be helpless in a view of very radical, robust American action, military action. We could recall Venezuela before.
Yeah.
We could also recall a previous Israeli strike supported by the US in June against Iran. Even before, the Russians have lost Syria to some extent because of the outing of Assad regime. There has been a whole series of problems, challenges for Russia globally, proving that actually Moscow has a very limited ability to react and to effectively influence, especially the US policies. So this kind of humiliation to some extent, and prove that Moscow cannot help even those countries which it is in a strategic partnership. We have to remember that only a bit more than a year ago, Russia and Iran had forged another new interstate agreement on complex strategic partnership between Iran and Moscow. So these two countries have been cooperating politically, economically, and in military for decades.
Right.
And Iran played a very important role in Moscow's efforts to undermine the network of Western US-led alliances globally. So Iran has been a very important Russia's ally in its anti-Western policies, in its de facto war against the West. So for that reason, undermining Iranian regime and proving that Moscow really cannot help the regime effectively and could not stop the Americans from doing that was another humiliation for Moscow, was a huge political and propaganda blow for the Kremlin. This is obviously a problem because it suggests to the others, also Russia's allies, other countries with which Moscow cooperates, that they really cannot rely on Moscow's support, and they can be saved by any means by Russia. It also clearly proved that military supplies of Russian weapons, and Iran was also important receiver of the Russian equipment, including anti-missile systems, were proved to be basically ineffective in direct confrontation with powerful American and Israeli capabilities. So this is another bad advertisement for Russia and for Russian military industrial complex, which may, of course, also impact to some extent the Russian cooperation and Russian supplies abroad. These are the biggest obvious disadvantages for Moscow, but they are, however, advantages. One important one also was in political sphere. Russia could really play on the rise of anti-American sentiments across the globe, especially within the so-called global south, because Russians can say that these are Americans and Israelis who undermine the foundations of rule-based order, the foundations of international law,
Right.
and all norms and principles. And they are, in fact, repeating some neo-colonial policies. And it is not Moscow which really violates, but it's the U.S. So they can be blamed for that. And to some extent, it serves the purpose of washing out the accusations against Russia that it uses military instrument to defend its self-perceived interests, sometimes in very harsh, brutal manner, and trying to depose the unfriendly regimes. So immediate comparisons with Russia's war in Ukraine are here. So Moscow can use it to make it relative, make it basically a proof that it's not unusual for the great power as which Russia consider itself to act in this manner. So these are political, but they are also important economic consequences. The biggest hopes of Russia in that respect was that this conflict will continue, that Americans won't be successful in an attempt to have a quick operation of a regime change in Iran, which would obviously create much problems for Russia, but they will stuck in this war. They will be using a much military systems capabilities, which then could not be used, for example, for purchases by European countries to arm Europe in defense against Russia, or to rearm Ukraine by the purchases of the American equipments by Europeans and sending it to Ukraine.
Right.
So they count that dragging in within the Middle East, within Iran, US will be weakened, will be preoccupied, and will use some resources, creating more problems and more troubles for itself and for the whole West, especially by raising of oil prices and creating energy crisis.
Exactly.
And we can see early indicators which may suggest that this dream scenario of Russians start to be fulfilled, because we have a spike in oil prices even if now it's seemed to be slightly improving. But choking point, which is the Strait of Hormuz, really creates enormous challenges for the West, but also for the global South, for which again, on one hand, makes US and Israel perceived as troublemakers, which is politically useful for Moscow, but also it provides Russia with some opportunities because, as we witnessed just a few days ago, uh, some sanctions has been weakened by the US, which were introduced against Russia in terms of limiting
Yeah.
export of Russian oil, especially to India.
Yeah.
That was one of the biggest customers of Russian oil. And Russia suffered from enormous drop of its sell to India by 70% over the last half a year in the wake of the American sanctions. And now the Americans themselves are interested in releasing the Russian oil and making it available for India to mitigate the negative consequences of the global choke point with Strait of Hormuz. Uh, it produces immediate benefit for Russia. The rise of prices also considers Urals benchmark produced by Russia. It is still far below the Western brands like Brent, but still, uh, Russia have now slightly improved situation in terms of their incomes, which have
Right.
fallen considerably.
Yes.
They have fallen almost 50% in comparison to last year before the recent spike. So now this is kind of saver
Right. Right.
for the Russian economy when we have those spike of prices. Uh, there is some at least temporary relief for the Russian economy. It may be temporary. It probably would be temporary, but still, it will depend on how long this conflict will continue, and especially how long the Strait of Hormuz will be effectively closed for shipping of
Right.
energy resources. And
Yeah.
one more thing is that Russia is seeing now the spike of gas prices in Europe, and Putin himself could not hide his joy organizing advertised meeting in Moscow on that matter and suggesting to the Europeans in kind of indirect message that they have now a chance to rethink their policies against towards Russia. So forget about implementation of the EU European Commission plans to fully stop imports of gas, especially LNG, from Russia, but reconsider this policy, return to Russia, to imports from Russia. And Moscow is ready to be open on its terms to consider that. And otherwise, Russia is starting to consider total closure of its sell to Europe, with exceptions of friendly regimes in Bratislava and Budapest. So this is the message from Moscow,
Yeah.
which clearly suggests that Russia sees immediate window of opportunity with this conflict and its economic consequences.
Mm, mm. And the money that Russia gets from this higher oil prices, probably it will go directly in the state budget, I imagine. But we can also maybe assume that it will be used for military purposes as well. We could probably assume that
Of
as well.
course,
Yeah.
absolutely,
Yeah.
because about a half or more of Russian state budget goes for the purpose of so-called national defense
Wow.
and internal security, and most of those are war-related spending. So, yes, absolutely, the potential increase of energy revenues for the Russian budget immediately transfers to the increase of capabilities, of financial capabilities to finance war, and also simultaneously to finance ongoing militarization of Russia, because we have to understand that beside the immediate involvement and with heavy costs into war against Ukraine, Russia actively prepares for the war, for the general war with NATO in Europe, and is on the path of very intensive militarization. So it needs money for that, and it will be definitely used for speeding up this process.
Right, right. Yeah, I think that's something that we should all be concerned about. I want to get back a little bit about Iran and the relationship between Russia and Iran, and just get your thoughts. Do you think that Iran was expecting more from Russia in terms of support? Because they do have this, they did at least have some sort of strategic partnership, as you mentioned. And how do you think will affect the fact that that Iran is being weakened? Would it affect Russia's capabilities in Ukraine? Or has it managed to already, because we know they produce the Shahid joints, for example, in Russia already. So is there any impact on that?
Well, starting maybe with Shaheds. Well, they are not a serious issue now. Yes, of course, Iran has played very important role in providing Russia with Shahed capability in the past. That
Yeah.
was quite important in the first years of this conflict. But since the production has been moved to Russia, and basically Russia became, to a large extent, independent from the immediate Iranian support on that, it is not a great issue. So Russia would not be stripped off the Shaheds because of the current conflict, because Russia produces itself using the license which it has received, technology which has received from Iran. But in terms of your first question, well, it's difficult to judge what really Iran counted for, because we have to also remember that Russians, even providing Iran with capabilities and cooperating intensively, actually have not crossed certain lines. For example, in the strategic interstate agreement, which we already mentioned, they haven't been introduced any elements of casus foederis, of kind of formal military guarantees of support by Russia, which was, by the way, different than in clauses introduced into Russian-North Korean state agreement. So by that, we could already judge that Moscow doesn't really wish to be bound by any concrete guarantees provided. I mean, it is not ready to provide ironclad guarantees, security guarantees to Iran, because it understands, Moscow understands, that Iran is quite vulnerable, and in the case of sort of action, such a military action, Russia would not really be wanted to be drawn into that. So it definitely, that was understood in Tehran, and there were limits of the Iranian expectations towards Moscow, but they may have had hopes that because of the ongoing talks between Russia and the US, that the Moscow may possibly have certain leverage on Washington. Also, not wishing the US to really escalate, and not wishing the US to expand its influences. But I'm really skeptical about the high level of expectations by Iranians towards Moscow.
Hmm. I wanted to ask about the negotiation process which is taking place on the side between Russia and Ukraine, mediated by the U.S., and get your opinion. Listeners of our podcast know that I'm very skeptical of the Russian intentions. I'm guessing you probably are as well. But I would like to hear your thoughts and what do you think the Russians are trying to get out of this when in terms of the participating in this process, going through the motions, going to the meetings. Is there, what's the Russian aim and perspective here?
Well, first of all, the Russians are really faking the peace process here.
Mm,
They're not genuinely interested in any compromise solution. What they're interested in is victory.
hmm
And victory, not necessarily by the means of a military offensive, which they proved to be incapable of in terms of, they are really struggling to
Yeah,
conquer the whole Donbass,
right.
which was the original stated goal of their operation. But they've bet on political factors, basically weakening of the Western side. They were, first of all, hoping that the Americans would be interested in either a quick fix of that conflict, as stated numerously by Trump himself,
Mm,
uh, meaning that in the eyes of Moscow, that is Ukraine which has to pay the price of it by basically agreeing to most of the maximalist demands issued by Moscow, which
right.
equals basically Ukraine's surrender, the conditional surrender of Ukraine. And Russian provided numerous times the terms, broad terms for that, and they were introduced in the Russian demands also, and partly reflected in some versions of so-called peace plan
Mm,
uh, presented by the US. So the first option would be for Americans to, in fact, impose the terms of peace, mostly dictated by Moscow, on Kiev.
mm,
However, I believe that Russians themselves were quite realistic in their assessment that it's low probability scenario, and that due to the both Kiev resistance and European lobbying against it, because it's also not in interest of European security,
yeah.
it would rather be difficult to achieve. So the second best option, but more realistic in the eyes of Moscow, would be basically to make Trump fed up with Ukraine,
Mm,
fed up with this conflict, to say that this is Europe's problem, which Europe has to be solved by itself, and basically withdraw all kinds of support for Ukraine, including ISR, including intelligence, reconnaissance, telecommunications, so Starlinks, and possibly even banning the purchase of American weapons
mm,
for Ukraine. So that would mean also disconnecting the issue of Ukrainian settlement and the issue of normalization of American-Russian relations. And Moscow hopes was that Trump will stop supporting Ukraine. It will make Europeans put in more difficult position in terms of sustaining the support for Kiev. And effectively, in some time, it will degrade the capability of Ukraine for resistance in the front line, and
right.
it make Russia more capable in terms of achieving some military successes in Ukraine. But even
Mm,
more, that it will make Trump ready to start the process of relaxation of sanctions against Russia.
mm,
to respond to the business offers Moscow has been sending to Washington, addressing, first of all, some concrete people around Trump, some business partners of Donald Trump, in an attempt to create leverage for the US policies. So basically, to some extent, to bribe the Trump administration by the offer of many millions, not necessarily billions, because those numbers who are flying are inflated and they really are not realistic in terms of execution, most of them. So it is not about, in fact, realization, fulfillment of those plans, because Russians are not really ready to allow Americans to be really involved in some strategic businesses, especially extraction business, energy extraction, or in the critical minerals in Russia, because Russians are very, very cautious in terms of allowing access. So, of course, minority shares, yes. Technological transfer, yes, absolutely. Financial transfer, great. But first of all, relaxation of sanctions or total lift of sanctions, which would open up the possibilities for Russia to enter the markets and use the capital and technology basically to improve their own economic potential. In that scenario, Russia would expect the Europeans to get in trouble in terms of sustain their sanction policies against Russia. Because inevitably, if Americans lift sanctions against Russia, Europe is really in a very difficult position to continue, because lobbying of some business circles, some political circles inside member states of the EU would grow. And that may lead to, even the crisis in terms of the sanctions prolongation by the EU. So this is the hope Moscow had. And the question is, to what extent Iranian conflict influenced that? That's a very important and difficult question to respond, because I think the Russians, they are sort of paranoid in political terms. So what we can judge from their communication, very harsh statements immediately after the start of the current American and Israeli campaign in Iran, very harsh statements against the US and Israel, and Putin very emotional message to the Iranian leadership, grieving after the killing of Khamenei. It has really suggested that Russians are very much angered, and Putin himself is very emotional, and he sees a threat coming from the US, a threat of a whole chain of policy actions which will not only undermine Russia's positions globally, but it will create certain pattern of a US policies, meaning the regime change policies towards the unfriendly regimes. And obviously, Russia feels to some extent, of course, given also taking into consideration huge differences, because Russia considers itself a great power, nuclear power, and it believes that it cannot be treated as Iran by the US. But still, there is a fear, deeply held fear in Moscow, that US can think about using pressures against Russia, both economic, political, and maybe even some security pressures on the outskirts, by also in some cases playing on tensions within Russia to really undermine Putin's regime for the purpose of getting some concessions or rewards for Washington. So it increases the deeply held distrust towards the US and Trump himself, which has not disappeared. This is a systemic thing in Russia, but it has increased that feeling in Moscow. And the effect of that is definitely a cool down of the Russian hopes that there could be some positive and quick fixes in terms of Ukraine. So Russia basically is sending a rather cool signal that, well, the continuation of negotiations is under question mark. Well, we have our demands. They have to be met. And if you are not ready to meet our demands on Ukraine, nothing will happen. I mean, the war will continue, basically, and we are ready for that. And in terms of the offers, business offers to Washington, well, they are theoretically on the table, but it's up to US really to go this path. So the US, it must take US to change their policies. Russia is not going to do anything to help the US. This is the US, this is the Trump administration, which needs to prove that they're interested actively in having those offers somehow fulfilled.
Yeah.
So effectively, the Russian approach has been stiffened. So they cooled down. They became less vocal and less positive towards the US, but still believing that this conflict would weaken the US and the West in general, and it will improve the position of Russia vis-a-vis the West and create some windows of opportunities for Moscow.
Let me ask one last question, because we haven't talked yet about China. And I'm just curious if this is also a window of opportunity for Russia and China to somehow cooperate more. I mean, how they also see what's happening, in the framework of their own strategic, let's say, partnership. Is this also, do you see a scenario where Russia and China will even strengthen even more cooperation because of what's happening in the Middle East?
Well, for sure. We can already see that. I mean, Beijing have assumed more or less same position towards this conflict as Russia did.
Yeah.
So we have to also recall that they co-sponsored the draft UN Security Council resolution on Iran. I mean, they've first of all they've called the emergency meeting of the UN, and they both condemned this American-Israeli actions. They also cooperate with Iran, and they use Iran in their policies against the US and the West. So, and they also thinking about potential consequences for this conflict, both in terms of disadvantages and advantages for them. So, yes, the fact that there is sort of a cool down between Moscow and Washington is definitely welcomed in Beijing. And Russia also needs, actually, in their policies towards the US, the sign of increase of cooperation with China, because this is a kind of a message also to Washington. This is because of your adventurous policies, because of your unwillingness to be constructive towards us and taking on board our demands, we will continue and expand our cooperation with your arch enemy, which is China. So this is the message to Washington. And what the Russians hope for is that it should trigger some response by the US, not in a form of punishment of Russia, but the opposite. It will increase some search in Washington for the ways to tone down the Russian frustration, and to seek some ways to weaken again the Russian-China link by the form of concessions towards Moscow. This is the Russian hope, that in fact the demonstration of continued cooperation between Russia and China would resonate in Washington not with negative actions, but with some attempts to provide Moscow with some opportunities. For example, through the sanction relaxation. So this is the Russian approach. This is the Russian tactics. This is Russian consideration in terms of that. But yes, I mean, in material ways, of course, the perception of the US as a threat, both in terms of their capabilities, military capabilities, in terms of their political will to impose their will on others, also by harsh means, testify to the very much systemic assessment of the US, both in Moscow and Beijing, that they're principal enemies, and they are strategic rivals, and they are existential threat to both regimes. So it will glue even more the strategic nature of the de facto alliance between Russia and China.
Well, Marek, thank you so much for your insights here. I think there are a lot of factors that we need to consider. That this conflict in Middle East is not isolated. It definitely impacts a lot of what's happening in our region as well. And I think you've done a really great job of outlining that for us. So thank you again for being with us. And I'm sure we're going to follow up at some point and see how things are going.
Great. Thank you all.